Thank you all for joining us. My name is Brechna Aftab, and on behalf of Haymarket Books, I'm so honored to welcome you all. It is a privilege to be hosting Mohammed El-Kurd and Robin D.G. Kelley in conversation today. Two writers who urge us to see that in the face of annihilation and indescribable horror, there are and always will be imaginative, complex, stubborn, creative people yearning and struggling for a world of beauty and freedom. Two writers who urge us to understand that our dreams of a future must always be forged in conversation with others, forged in collective movements. We're here to mark the publication of Mohammed's new book, Perfect Victims and the Politics of Appeal, a book that Robin has described as a new discourse on colonialism for the 21st century. Mohammed is from Jerusalem-occupied Palestine. In 2021, Mohammed was a leading organizer of the Save Sheikh Jarrah campaign, a movement to defend his neighborhood against colonial displacement. He is the nation's first ever Palestine correspondent and an editor-at-large at Mondoweiss. Mohammed is the author of the poetry collection Rifka and Perfect Victims, his first nonfiction book published today. Robin is a distinguished professor and the Gary B. Nash Endowed Chair in U.S. History at the University of California, Los Angeles. Robin is the author of several books and articles that have expanded our thinking on history, social movements, art, and so much more. His books include Freedom Dreams, Hammer and Hoe, and a biography of Thelonious Monk. Robin writes that freedom dreams are born against fascist nightmares. In Perfect Victims, Mohammed writes that there is jasmine because seeds do not need permission to germinate. In their work, Robin and Mohammed urge us to understand misery, to know and analyze its roots and consequences, yet both writers, in the tradition of others before them, remind us that rather than misery, it is joy and love for community that pushes people to struggle and to change the world. Laughter is akin to faith, Mohammed tells us. The best kind of writing is writing that moves you, that enables you to recognize one another in a shared language of freedom. With their work, Mohammed and Robin offer us such writing, and we are honored to have them in conversation with us today.
Thank you so much. That was so beautiful introduction. That's better than when I, laid out. I have to say, just in preparation or by way of introduction, that in my opinion, Mohammed is one of the great thinkers of the 21st century. One of the really great minds. And if anyone's paying attention, they would know this. And ironically, he's only spent like 2 years in the last century. Well, I mean, like 26 years old. Like who does that? Who has an international reputation as writer, critic, journalist, poet, and activist? And someone who is one of my heroes and has been for some time. And so there's lots of things that could be said about Mohammed. We're going to try to move through these things in the next hour plus. But with that, I just want to welcome you into the space of Haymarket, a space that you know very well. Oh, before I forget, Rifka and Perfect Victims are both Haymarket books, which means that when you order Perfect Victims, you need to order Rifka too if you don't already have it. If you already have it, order another copy to give to a friend. In fact, you should order 5 copies of each because you must have more than 4 friends. Because if it doesn't make sense, like what kind of person are you if you only have like no friends? So that's what I want to say. Welcome, and thank you for giving me this time to have a conversation with you.
Oh my God, I am so honored. Yani, you have no idea how much this I've been looking for this for weeks. It's so exciting to be in conversation with you. I have admired your work for such a long time, and when I received your blurb for the book, I was just so shocked because I came to know the foreword you wrote for Discourse on Colonialism many
Hmm.
years ago, and it profoundly impacted me. And I wrote this book in that style, and
Right,
the fact that you
right,
noticed it meant a lot to me.
right, right. And it is powerful, and it is exactly what I say. First of all, most listeners who know me know that I'm always right. So I am right about what I said about this book, and I think everyone agrees with me on this. It is, in many ways, a new discourse on colonialism for the 21st century because, one, as you've been saying all along, colonialism is hardly over. I'm talking about formal, violent, um, uh, genocidal colonial domination has been, this has been the story of Palestine, but the story of Palestine has also been resistance, has been a refusal to accept, uh, the human rights discourse on what a victim's supposed to be. So I want to kind of begin there with you. Um, One, sort of, how did you come to write this book? What drew you to it? But more importantly, or equally important, is when did you begin writing this book? Because, as you know, things have been moving so swiftly, even in the last few weeks. You know?
There are many ways I could answer the question. Yani in lots of ways, I have been writing this book since I was a teenager in my mind, right? It's kind of a rebellion against my own upbringing in advocacy. I was like many Palestinians. I was a child activist thrust into the realm of advocacy in spite of myself, and I was forced to rehearse and memorize this script of the perfect victim, this kind of to wear a certain Western approved civility and practice it in front of the diplomats, the eager and observant and often voyeuristic diplomats and journalists who would come visit our house, which was taken by settlers at a very young age, and you become suffocated by this script that you are forced to learn. Um, but I wanted to write it first as a rebellion against my own tendencies and impulses to concede to the Western colonial logic. But it's also kind of not a call to arms, but it's a call for everybody in our movement, everybody who is pro-Palestinian or pro the marginalized in general,
Right.
to reassess and interrogate their tactics of advocacy. It's an incomplete call for an open discourse about
Mm-hmm.
our tactics throughout the years. And I wrote it in the shadow of genocide. I started, I think, January, February 2023, and I finished in October, September. But it's not only about genocide. I think it's largely about the Palestinian condition and by extension the human condition.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. It is a measure of the human condition. And, I think most listeners or viewers know that, um, of course, we could talk about when this violence begins, so 100 years plus, but also just to remind people that January 2023 was a period of heightened violence in the West Bank. I mean, really heightened violence. And so to sort of think of October 7th, even as a break for 2023, is not even accurate. And in fact, it kind of explains a lot. So, one of the things that I'd love for you to talk about, you know, um, like I've seen film footage of you as a kid, right, in Sheikh Jarrah, talking about what's going on and quite incredibly poised. And one of the things that I always tell people, like my first trip to Palestine was 2012, January 2012. And I was in Sheikh Jarrah, I think at the Hanun house. And I have, film footage of having conversations, which were being translated. And I have to say, of all the places I've been in the West Bank, I mean, Sheikh Jarrah was the most moving, most terrifying. I mean, even more than Hebron, you know. And I just would love to for you to talk a little bit about uh, talk more about growing up there and also the struggle to preserve the space, especially given that it is a space where a lot of activists would show up, and try to, non-Palestinian activists show up and try to make a stance. And yet, if anyone knows, literally, you got people got Israelis and American settlers moving into houses, like forcing people out of houses, like right in front of our eyes. I never in my life seen anything like that before. So could you talk about that, growing up there, and how it shaped your own thinking and writing, both as not just as an activist and a nonfiction writer, but also as a poet?
I think you did an incredible job of describing the absurdity, the absolute absurdity of the reality in Sheikh Jarrah. On paper, it's forced displacement, it's ethnic cleansing, it's forced expulsion, it's a brutality of the colonizer over the native. But in effect, and the way that this brutality is practiced is so absurd that it's almost comical. Like you said, we had literal American Jewish settlers, some of them evading fraud charges and whatnot, coming all the way to seek refuge in our houses, saying that God endowed them with these houses with divine decree, and they were utilizing the help of an already asymmetrical colonial judiciary that was built for this very purpose, built for the advancement of settlement. And yet in the world and in the public arena, this was all of this catastrophic, devastating, absurd violation of our lives was referred to in media and on the global stage as a real estate dispute. Right? It was framed as this legal issue, when in fact it was purely political. It was purely of colonial motives. And what was clearly an act of forced expulsion was constantly framed as "quote unquote" an eviction. This isn't to say that evictions are not necessarily violent. They are, and we know, particularly in the United States, the effects of gentrification, how violent and abhorrent they are. This is not the point I'm trying to make here, but just the obfuscation of the truth, the kind of fabrication of nuance around the truth, is really what inspired me to write about it, because to me it was so flagrant, it was so stark, and I wanted people to call things by their name. And then this extends beyond just Sheikh Jarrah, because Sheikh Jarrah has a microcosm, but it extends beyond it. So if in Sheikh Jarrah it was a real estate dispute, when in fact it's ethnic cleansing and forced displacement, in Gaza what they refer to as a development plan is also ethnic cleansing. And we can talk about Silwan, and we can talk about South Hebron, the examples of the mutilation, the examples of the mutilation of language in service of the colony are endless.
That's right. Yeah, and I think people don't realize when you go there, the most striking thing, besides the horrible racist graffiti, is the fact that they plant flags on top of the house. They put Israeli flags on the house. That's old school, settler seizure, right? To claim the flag, which is also a recognition that no matter what they may claim God is telling them, it is not just individuals, it is a national seizure of land. It's a national seizure and a national expulsion backed by the United States.
100%.
So to go back to thinking about your poetry, and you made a choice to write this beautiful. To me, it's one of the reasons why it's like discourse to me is that it is kind of a prose poem. In other words, it moves in between. It's not journalism, and yet it's deeper than that. It is a deeper truth that comes from the soul. Like what you write comes from the soul, and then you really feel it. And I was hoping that you could both talk a little bit about the process of putting this book together, who you want to read this book, and the work you wanted to do. I mean, I could imagine for myself the work you wanted to do, especially right now when there's a feeling of, I'm trying not to be pessimistic, but there's a kind of feeling of resignation among people who had been so active in struggle. And this is the worst time to express any sort of resignation. And then this book really is a kind of call to arms, a demand, not just to return to the way things were, but to remind us what resistance really entails. That we cannot allow the idea of the perfect victim to get in the way of what is required to overthrow colonial domination, and that is actual resistance by resistance fighters. Something that no one wants to talk, not actually no one, but it's hard to talk about in this particular climate, and yet we don't really have a choice, right? So again, I know that's a mouthful, but if you could just kind of riff on this, on what you want this book to do, what do you think of, what do you want us to know about the perfect victims? What is the work? And especially the second part of the title is the politics of appeal, which is something that many of us have given up on, or many of us continue to do, especially in the face of international institutions that don't really do anything, like the United Nations. So if you could talk a little bit about some of these things that I just kind of laid out.
Yeah, I mean it's a really good question. Particularly, you mentioned that we are in a period of resignation. I think this is also a period of heartbreak, right? Because over the past 15 months, we've seen unprecedented levels of support for the Palestinian cause. We have seen unprecedented numbers of people on the streets, and it almost seems as though these numbers have dissipated, obviously, or disappeared. Obviously, there's repression and suppression and kinds of state crackdown on dissent, on anti-colonial sentiment. There are reasons for this kind of disappearance. But after so much hope for a change, it seems as though we are in a period of heartbreak, and it's the most dangerous period to be in, because you don't want your heartbreak over what could have been to hinder you from doing what should be done. With this book, there were lots of editorial choices and stylistic choices that were, inherently political. Obviously, I owe a great deal of credit to my editor, Berna, who you all spoke to, or spoke to you earlier. But, I wanted to cite poets as voices of authority. I intentionally left out the law, the international law, United Nations, statistics of these sorts, because I think these are, vehicles that people should continue to use, but I am tired of them, and I am tired of the pretense that the international law or these international courts or the United Nations are anything but, false idols that people worship. And I also cited a lot of Palestinian proverbs and Arab proverbs and proverbial knowledge in general in the thesis and in the argumentative parts of this book, because proverbial knowledge, the knowledge that is generational or oral and so on, is often frowned upon as unscientific. And in fact, I think if it weren't for proverbial knowledge, I wouldn't have become who I am today. I owe it to my grandmother and the kind of proverbs she would spit at the television while watching the news. I owe that my entire understanding of global dynamics. She used to watch the news, and she would say, they asked the pharaoh who made you a pharaoh. This is an old Egyptian proverb. They asked the pharaoh, I use this in the book. They asked the pharaoh who made you a pharaoh, and the pharaoh responded, no one stopped me. And that instilled in me as a child something, And then you grow up and you read these ideas into books and so on. But it was really, the statistics, the UNRWA stuff, the human rights law, all of these things are avenues that I am sick of trying to find refuge in, because these are avenues that have continuously displaced me, and I wanted to try to look for different arenas in which I can do my advocacy. And this is not, I hesitate to call this book a book of critique, but it's really just a call for people to try and reevaluate our tactics, and to have honest conversations with each other, and to try different things, if I'm going to put it in simple terms. But ultimately, the thesis of the book, maybe I shouldn't say this, but the thesis of the book is quite straightforward, right? It's something that has been echoed by the feminist movement, by the Black radical tradition, by many movements before the Palestinian movement. But my goal was to take the reader on a journey of challenge, of constant challenge, to see how far they are willing to go with me as an ally.
Right, and that's the challenge that I think people need to really take seriously, especially in these times, because these are dangerous times. It was always dangerous in Palestine, and it's getting worse. But I mean, people need to take that journey with you. I mean, one of the things I was going to ask you about, or want to ask you about, is the beautiful and difficult chapter on Shireen Abu Akleh, and how, so much of, like, one of the really profound points you make is, and I think you said this on Democracy Now! This morning when I was listening, is that, once she was proclaimed an American, right, as opposed to Palestinian, that was a kind of double death. That was like a second death. And it's amazing how this discourse on, well, the American citizen is, and of course, this is beyond Palestine. This is every single person killed by drones under Obama, under, whoever. If they're American citizens, somehow there's an exception. And that your refusal of that exception, I think, and reclamation, that reclaiming of who she is, I think, really critical. So I want to read this quote, which I want you to talk a little bit about, from that chapter, when you write, "Our cause, as imagined in this mythology, is no longer understood as a liberation struggle, but as a humanitarian crisis. We're revolutionaries, not part and parcel of our nation, motivated by political aspirations and dreams of emancipation." If you could talk about that line,
Yeah, I mean, it's this categorization of, or what you could call the invention of the civilian, right? What does it mean to be a civilian? And what this category of the civilian, which is very restricted, and it's almost oblivious to the political context, and it's oblivious not only to political context, but to basic biology and to basic common sense. It's the idea that there are women and children in societies who live dismayed by current affairs, and they live on the the sidelines of these things, and they're just observers who have no stake in the game. Meanwhile, the fighters, the militants, are wreaking havoc senselessly, doing so, deviating from the remainder of society. And this fragmentation of the fabric of Palestinian society, and by extension, the fabric of all the marginalized communities, is colonial by design. It is meant to divide people into categories of the killable and the grievable, and the killable and the grievable, the killable and those who we save, the condemned and those who we absolve. And then even within those categories, there are subcategories. So if you're, it's not funny, but it's a bit ironic. If you're a journalist, you are in the category of the civilians, or of the people who deserve life. But then there's another division. If you're a local journalist, your death is not going to warrant you a headline. If you're an American journalist, you're going to find yourself a spot in the headline. But some say that the overemphasis on citizenry and citizenship is a means to an end. They say that the United States has an obligation towards its citizens. But so far, and in 75 years of Israeli occupation and Israeli brutality against Palestinians, we have not seen the Americanness or the alleged
Right.
Americanness of certain Palestinians who are slain. We haven't seen this Americanness provide them with anything other than a ruckus and the headline. In fact, pure Americans like Rachel Corrie, who was crushed to death by an Israeli bulldozer, has yet her case has yet to see any kind of justice. So this
Right.
paradigm, although a means to an end, needs to be reevaluated.
Exactly. And it never actually produces anything. That's what's so
Yeah.
interesting, is that even when they were emphasizing um, Shireen's American citizenship, or you know, there was never any serious outcry. There was no investigation of any sort. They passed the investigation on to Israelis, so it almost doesn't matter, and that makes it even more offensive. Um, and this is something I would love for you to comment on. I mean, we see this all the time. I mean, I come out of a tradition in which Black revolt is always told you can't be violent. Violence. We don't tolerate violence. This comes from Obama. I remember that during Ferguson. Oh, you can't be violent. Don't be violent. As the state imposes enormous um, uh, um, uh, disproportionate violence on people who are engaged in nonviolent protest, and there's no consequence. So let alone violence. And so I'm wondering, especially now, when it appears that all this bluster on the part of Trump about, buying, it's kind of funny, but it's not funny, buying Gaza in massive population transfer, which is part of the genocidal machine of the entire Palestinian population in Gaza. Um, what do you say? What are your thoughts about this talk, especially in relationship to an argument I feel like you're making, and that is we do have to pay attention to what it means to be a revolutionary. We do have to recognize that long resistance struggles are what's necessary for emancipation. I mean, everyone's reading Fanon, and if you read Fanon, then not even just about violence, but about the insistence on resistance and the refusal to accept the colonial violence as normative. What do you say in this particular climate, especially given the stuff that's happening right now? What's the urgent position for you?
It's you can look at violence, and you can look at violence that is committed by men in tracksuits, men, bare-chested men, not just the kids who throw rocks at tanks, but men with makeshift rockets. And this is a violence that is almost universally condemned, that is support for it can land you in jail. Meanwhile, the violence of militaries, the systemic, brutal, and enormous violence of states and armies, is seen as this like almost boring fact of life that is business as usual, that doesn't compel the viewer. It's something that in their peripheral vision, it's something that they have accepted. But what's interesting is, outside of the systemic violence, what really always gets the headlines is systematic violence. Semantic violence. And what I mean by the so-called semantic violence, what I mean by this is that we could be killed and, blown up to smithereens and so on and so forth. But if they dig up a tweet or dig up an old article from a martyr or from a person who's been killed that's quote unquote offensive or bigoted or what so on, that is heavily scrutinized. What we say as Palestinians is heavily, heavily, heavily scrutinized. Language, it seems, receives a lot more attention than actual bombs and airstrikes. And I think in the case of Donald Trump and his kind of rogue tongue, this can work in our favor in a lot of ways, because he is not necessarily deviating from the long-term. If we understand American project as a long-term project of imperialism, of extraction, of expansion, of creating this eternal war in the Middle East, of sustaining its colonial offshoot, the Israeli regime, then what Trump is calling for is not a deviation. It is simply uttered explicitly. It is simply said explicitly. And an example that I love to cite that to me is kind of hilarious is Bezalel Smotrich, who is the Israeli finance minister, has said on multiple occasions that there's no such thing as Palestinians, or that that Palestinian people do not exist. And there was one instance when he said this, that even the White House had something to say, rebuffed him, had something to say about what he had to say. But if you look at Israeli law, Palestinian people do not exist. It is true. Right. On the ground, we do not exist. In their laws, in their policies, we are treated as though we are invisible, right? So the issue is not with the policy or the action, but the issue is kind of with the aesthetics, with the optics of these actions. And unfortunately for these, war hawks and imperialists and colonizers and Zionists, many of them have perfected this very polite script that absolves them, almost gets them off the hook. As long as they're saying, oh, we want a two-state solution, as long as they're saying, oh, the Israelis deserve security and the Palestinians deserve their own state, and blah, 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 while they're actively bulldozing our neighborhoods and eating away at our lands, they can get off scot-free. But as soon as some of them flips the script, then there is uproar. And so if we understand the world in this way, in this dynamic, then we should be exploiting this unfortunate fact of life. We should exploiting the likes of Smotrich and Ben Gvir and Donald Trump. And I think also the media's hatred of Trump is playing a big role in the kind of outrage against him. And I guarantee you, and I know this from the past 15 months, that any time President Biden has funded, aided, or abetted ethnic cleansing and forced displacement and literal genocide, there was hardly any outcry from mainstream media in the United States.
That's right. And I can agree with you more on that, which is pretty, it's not surprising, but what we think of as the so-called liberal media in the United States, they've always avoided the question of Palestine, always took a stance in defense of Israel, and it's precisely because of what's seen as an extreme position, that is the seizure of Gaza for the United States. It is in many ways a manifestation of basically since 1948, and that's what we're looking at. So yeah, I hear you. I have a few other questions I want to pose. A couple questions here that some other people have raised, but also my own question really is about poetry, and about I feel like you're part of an amazing you're an amazing company as a poet, and I really want to emphasize that you dedicate the book to Repeat Alawer. I think about poets who are still with us, like Fadi Judah, for example. I think about Musab Abu Toha, the martyred Heda Abu Nada. There's so many amazing poets. And yet there's also so many poets who are in the grave prematurely because of their role as revolutionaries. Where is poetry? What is the place of poetry in this struggle right now?
To answer the question about where poetry is right now, one must look at the place of poetry in the past, and in the specific case of Palestinian struggle and Palestinian history, poets have played historically a massive role in fueling the masses, in synthesizing certain incredibly bureaucratic and impenetrable colonial language and making it accessible to the everyday Palestinian. I mean, my favorite example of this, and an example that I've used a million times already, is Rashid Hussein and his poem God is a Refugee, in which he is
Mm-hmm.
satirating the absentee property law, which entitled the Israeli regime to the homes and properties of Palestinians that were forcibly transferred and forcibly displaced in the Nakba, and the Israeli land law, which designated 93% of historic Palestine to be quote unquote state owned.
Mm-hmm.
These poems and these poetries have cultivated, um, cultivated, uh, strikes and national strikes and uprisings and revolutions, and they have really, really shaped our political consciousness. I grew up in a school system that is controlled by the Israeli military, and
Mm-hmm.
our textbooks had full blank pages where poems once were, fully blank pages.
Wow.
And our teachers would still read us the poems that were censored out of the books. My
Oh,
mother
that's
was a
beautiful.
poet. Yeah, and my mother was a poet, and she would write poetry in the local Palestinian paper that would be censored by the Israeli military center, much like, by the way, the New York Times and other um, international outlets in Palestine. My mother would send in her poems, and they would come back redlined by the Israeli military censor.
Mm.
And this is true not just in the case of poetry, but in the case of any digestible language that can be acquired and recycled by the masses. I mean, even Facebook posts have been
Right,
landing people in jail for the past 15 months.
right. Amazing. I mean, to waste time to print, to actually have a blank page is itself, uh, um, just a high order of disrespect. Okay, so on that theme, so who are the writers you admire and that you feel you're in conversation with?
I I would really hesitate to say that I'm in conversation with anyone because I think I have so much uh, to learn and to read. But I think the writers that kind of inspire me and influence me are so many, but particularly I would say Césaire. I have some ideological disagreements, obviously, but Césaire is like one of my favorite writers. Fanon, Rashid Hussein, the Palestinian poet that I mentioned, is one of
Right.
my favorite poets of all time. An Egyptian revolutionary poet called Amal Dunqul is another one who I admire. Palestinian Americans would include the legendary Suhair Hamad, who I came to know I came to know her poetry when I was a teenager. I mean, when I was in high school, I would read Toni Morrison, and it was really hard, but I would read Toni Morrison and Audre Lorde. And recently, when I started to write this book, I also read Sylvia Wynter and
Mm-hmm.
Sylvia Hartman. Also, Sylvia Wynter is quite hard to read, but there's many. I'm sure I'm forgetting a lot, but there's many, particularly from the Black radical tradition, that have really shaped my thinking. Also, just maybe not writers by craft, but like George Jackson. George Jackson's whole critique of prestige in Blood in My Eye
Mm-hmm.
really,
Right.
really, really opened my eyes to how do how how do I extend my critique of or institutions like the New York Times past
Mm-hmm.
accusations of double standards? What is it about the New York Times that I must dismantle beyond their asymmetrical practices? And it is the prestige that these organizations have over our minds.
Right, right. It's funny you mentioned Suhair Hamad. I met her at City College, I think around before you were born, and she was very young at the time. Amazing poet. Just all those folks are really incredible. And speaking of poets and artists, I did have a question about the beautiful cover art on the book, um, Perfect Victims. Can you talk about the artists? Um, Maisara Baroud, you know.
Yeah. Maysara Baroud is a Palestinian illustrator and artist. Maybe I think multimedia artist who is based out of the Gaza Strip, and he like this particular illustration is part of a larger series called I Am Still Alive, which he
Mhm.
developed over the course of the genocide from different from different tents and refugee tents across the Gaza Strip as he was running from displacement after the next. But one anecdote I want to share, actually, I don't know if I should or not, but I would like to share it. I don't know if it's the right call because, but I remember when I approached him about using this artwork, he told me that a few years ago he was talking to some friends about me and my generation, and he said, that he saw a lot of potential. I don't want to tell you what exactly he said, but he said he saw a lot of potential in our generation. And I remember I received that message during a time where I felt so futile and I felt like nothing we do, the written word has no power whatsoever. And to hear these words from somebody, who even under bombs is still producing knowledge, right? Ultimately,
Right.
is still using his tools to try to radicalize people. It kind of lit a fire under my ass.
Hmm. That's quite powerful. Of course, I couldn't agree more with him. I mean, he's right about that. You represent an amazing generation in such a powerful voice, both for the generation, but for many generations, in fact. Um, and that's really the importance of this book. We have more questions to address, but I wanted to just take this time out to remind people who are here that you can order this book right now. You can get as many copies as you want. And it's one of these texts that that will keep close to you all the time. Because I feel like the insights that you offer are insights that definitely are both about Palestine, but way beyond just Palestine. It's about what does it mean to be human in the face of disaster, of catastrophe. What does it mean to claim that humanity, and not let others define for you what that humanity is supposed to be without condition, unconditionally. Um,
That's very
so,
generous. Thank you so much.
boys, is this true? I mean, is this true? I wonder. Uh, I have some questions coming in here. I'm gonna skip over a couple and come back to them. Um, Actually, I'll go to this one. And this is a question, I guess, for uh, for both of us. Although I want you to answer it. What is a revolutionary poetic in a time of total collapse? What can poetics express that language cannot?
I mean, I would be eager to hear your answer, but my attempt at answering this is, I would say a revolutionary poetic is a poetic that extends beyond the page. I think so
Mhm.
many writers console themselves with the idea that they are doing what they call the work on the page. And I
Right.
think any kind of literary work that is detached or divorced from community, from the street, and also detached from the world, detached from the international order, isn't compelling to me. So, uh, we can write our poems about, overthrowing these institutions of total monopoly of knowledge production, like the New York Times, my
Hmm.
favorite punching bag. But also, how are we treating and interacting with such institutions in real time and in real life, and not only on the page? I think that what distinguishes, it's just looking at the literature we produce in a materialist way, and looking for its materialist impact in the world, I think, is the most important thing.
Right, right. And that speaks to language as well. I had uh, an incredible conversation with Fadi Judah recently about language and about Arabic and how important it is to speak and write in Arabic, to 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 basically kind of set visions of freedom within uh, a people's language. And in that case, the poetics are everywhere. The poetics are in the language, the poetics are in everyday language. The poetics are in every single time I listen to someone being interviewed about how indignant they are that there are 2,000-pound bombs being dropped coming from the United States, but also the refusal to beg, you know, that refusal to beg, that refusal to be contrite, to sort of insist that we will be here no matter what, and still express that level of anger. To me, oh, that's poetry. That's a certain kind of poetics.
100%.
You know, how does one, and this is really a question for, you know, your message or advice to young people, and you're young. It still cracks me up because I always think of you, you're like 50 years old, but you're like a young person. But how does one appropriately resist when in a conservative academic space, right? Like, and here's someone who's writing about, thinking about leaving this conservative academic space, but how do you resist in these spaces while here in ways that do not betray a conscience? You know, I mean, I hope that makes sense to you.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm not on a pulpit, so this is not a fatwa, you know, but I can do my best. I think, you know, the first thing is one should do an assessment of their own power and their own positionality in the academy. I think so much it is the students and the vulnerable in the academy who are willing to make the most sacrifices, and those who are protected are not even willing to take discursive risks, in my humble assessment. So I think once you have like a proper assessment of your power and your influence within the academy, then you begin to leverage that power cleverly. But the one thing that should be true across the board, not refusal, is our most powerful weapon, and it has been proven to be that across the years. So just, you know, to refuse complicity, to refuse to normalize brutality, racism, colonialism, to refuse to normalize colonial logic. And also, there needs to be an eagerness to have difficult conversations. You know, so many of our allies, and I say this in the metaphorical sense, but in the figurative sense, I grew up with so many of our allies spending their weekends in our home, eating from our food, chanting chants for us to hear. And then they go back to their families, to their countries, and they don't speak a word of what is going on. But right. I think sometimes there is nothing more profound or productive or fruitful a person can have than an incredibly tense Thanksgiving dinner or a Passover dinner.
Right.
You know, sometimes the war you need to wage is the war against the ignorances of your loved ones.
Mm-hmm. That's so true. That's so true. And, you know, I'm glad you mentioned what, you know, well, I guess we still call it that, kind of like, you know, a certain kind of left-wing tourism, you know, where people are going places, they observe, they're all moved, but they don't do the work. They don't do the work of basically not just reporting, but standing up and supporting, not just reporting, but supporting movements that are trying to reverse the situation. And I think about how frequent this is. In my class on nonviolence, I just had a student who talked about how frustrating it was to spend time organizing around the Dakota Access Pipeline, and how people like showed up in South Dakota in mass numbers to basically be with Native people and to sort of show their solidarity, but then they got in the way. They actually were eating a lot of the food, taking up space, and not really doing work. And this happens all the time, where, and my position always, and this is just to kind of give this perspective, for years, I've been to Palestine 3 times. I've always told people, I said, if you want to see images of violence and suffering, go on YouTube. But if you want to talk to people, I mean, the greatest intellectuals I've ever met, right, were in Palestine, in East Jerusalem, right? I mean, and if you want to engage people in conversation and learn, that's a different story. Because people talk about things you're not going to find on YouTube. But, if you just want to be edified by saying like, I saw that, then that's a different thing, and this is another reason why I think, go ahead.
It's voyeuristic. I mean, from my own experience, I grew up every single day. I would come home from school and I would drop my backpack and I would speak in broken English to foreign activists about our situation, but not what they digested from me was always kind of the pictures of the bruises, the pictures of my family members being beaten by settlers, the kind of absurdity of the brutality, but they never wanted to hear my framing of things. They never wanted to hear my analysis. And this is why when people say I had to go see for myself, that to me is such an arrogant thing to hear, because there is 100 years of Palestinian knowledge production.
Right.
And knowledge production about Palestine, not necessarily by Palestinians, that can provide you with a clear image of what's going on. But people go there for voyeuristic reasons that are almost fetishistic. And it's a different thing if you're going and you're engaging the Palestinians as equals. If you're, deepening and challenging each other's worldviews, it's a different thing. That is the optimal way to go. But this kind of what you call it leftist tourism or tourism of atrocity tourism I don't think is as it's not as formative as people say it is, because ultimately it depoliticizes what is going on, and it makes it merely about human tragedy or about humanitarian crises, when in fact the people whose limbs are amputated know who amputated their limbs, and the people whose homes are demolished know the genesis that brought the bulldozers to our neighborhoods and brought the judges that legalized these demolitions in the first place, right? This context is lost when we are treated like zoo animals, exhibiting our wounds and our tragedies to the curious, average American tourist.
Exactly. There's a long history of that too. I mean, even beyond Palestine, people going to Vietnam, people going to the South during the 1960s to see the violence and then go back home. So speaking of seeing and doing, we have a question about tactics. What kinds of tactics are sort of no longer working, and what new tactics should we be taking up? And I know some of this, even beyond tactics, strategies you lay out in the book about ways that we need to see and think differently. But what are your thoughts about like how to move forward? What kinds of tactics we should think about?
Well, instead of listing, what tactics works and what tactics don't work, I mean, I kind of try to do that a little bit in the book. Instead of that, I would just say dignity should always be our compass, right? A tactic that is informed by indignity will always, always fail. And an example of this, so that I'm not so abstract, is oftentimes we cite Israeli human rights organizations that say that, quote, Israel is an apartheid state, or that say, quote, Israel is engaging in genocide, even though I don't even know if an Israeli organization has said that yet. But we do not cite them by virtue of them being human rights organizations. We cite them by virtue of them being Israeli first. And this practice is informed by understanding of the world as a racist place that will discredit and debunk or refuse to believe the findings of Palestinian human rights organizations or Arab human rights organizations, and it will trust Israeli human rights organizations on the basis that they are unbiased. But
they're objective.
Right. But what this approach does, well, one could call it a strategy. What this approach does is that it further devalues the work of Palestinians. It further devalues the work of the native, and it further reinforces the supremacy of the colonizer, the authority that they have over narrating what's taking place on the ground. So I think we need to be, I think long-sighted is the opposite of short-sighted. We just need to think about the future and about what is this tactic going to do to the dignity or the self-formation of this population or of this nation. I say in the book, I say in the book someplace, not to quote myself like an asshole, but I say in the book, what is it that we inspire in each other? Is it self-respect or self-reproach?
Right.
And I think that, to me, that's my compass. I always want to be driven by self-respect.
Exactly. No, I remember that's a very powerful line, and it also reminds me too of something else we might want to talk about, and that is, and this is not recent. This goes back even before 1948. The Zionist states' targeting of Palestinian knowledge, both in terms of the destruction of libraries and bookstores and archives, but also the seizure of that knowledge, and through its own archives and libraries, and the denial of access to that knowledge. Like, the knowledge is so rich, and clearly the Zionist state understands that. That we don't need to turn to B'Tselem, or these other organizations for the evidence, when the evidence is clearly there, but being destroyed and burned and stolen left and right. I think, given your own relationship to books and to text, what do you see as the struggle to retain that knowledge? What do we do? And we can come to a close pretty soon. So.
It's a very difficult question. There's lots of archival work that's being done. The fact that the Israeli archives really contain our treasures, right? And Israeli journalists and humanitarians and filmmakers have, unprecedented access to these things that we can only dream of smelling. And then they go on to produce access journalism. That's a whole other conversation. But ultimately, also, I think there needs to be a lot more humility in the way we produce. This may be controversial. I haven't thought it through, but just my instinct is to say there needs to be a lot more humility in the way we produce knowledge. We do not need to reinvent the wheel. The book that describes the legal fragmentations of Palestinians already exists, and it can be uplifted. The work that tells you the story of the apartheid wall already exists, and it needs to be uplifted. The question then is, how do we go from, or let me phrase this differently. I go to events about Palestine, and I hear people speak about Palestine, and the event is explicitly branded as a Palestine event, and people have bought tickets even to attend this event. And yet, often, not always, often the talk on stage is quite elementary. It's still about green IDs and blue IDs and this law and that law, and in 1948 and in 1967, it's almost as though we don't think of the audience as active participants in the struggle, as people we need to challenge and people we need to inform and enrich with new knowledge, with new paradoxes, with new ideas. We think of them as mere spectators, as people who are suspicious of us, even despite their kind of announcement of allyship by coming to our events and blah blah blah. We're still treating them and offering them this basic knowledge that repeats itself. And I think now is the time to understand, it's been 75 years, if not 100 years, of reading the same script, and there are so many people who are willing to move to the next phase, who are eager to become our comrades and become our partners in the struggle. We are not constantly talking to spectators. Some people are trustworthy and are, we need to welcome. I don't know if that makes sense. Yani, it's kind of a new thought I'm formulating, but it's...
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. And it kind of leads me to the last couple of questions. One just has to do with, you're on tour now. You're talking about this book. Clearly you have a great publisher, you have, but how do you decide who you're going to talk to? Like who the audience is. And I think about that in two ways. One, given the hostility to anything having to do with Palestine, and the danger that's involved. And I hope that that you're secure and safe, because these people are not playing. But how do you make that decision about what to talk about, especially when so much of what the book is about is, the way I read it, is a critique of those that we think of as kind of liberal allies. You're not trying to win the popularity contest because you're telling the truth, which is always a hard thing. How do you make that decision about where to go, what to talk about, what to do, in terms of not just because you're not just promoting a book, you're trying to wake people up.
I think one of my biggest shortcomings as a writer is that I treat so many things as though they are implied. But I think that is one of my strengths as an activist, right? As a writer, you need to kind of meet the reader where they are, hold their hand through it, and kind of, persuade them and whatnot. But that, people like us who have been invisibilized, we believe that the world is not ours, that we are outsiders to this kind of extremely hegemonic, extremely racist and arrogant world. But the way I carry myself, and I think this is just informed by the many women, particularly, but many people in my family, is that I don't think I'm an outsider in the world. I think all of these people who have got it wrong are outsiders to my world, and they need to kind of decipher me and make me legible. I don't need to do that for them. Like what is I just refuse the premise that I need to enter their world. They need to enter mine, and they need to knock on the door to enter my world. It's kind of what Toni Morrison talks about, in the sense of she refers to it as sovereignty, like the sovereignty on her books. She says she said this in an interview, but so many of the African American books that she'd read, she felt as though there was a white person standing over her shoulders reading the book with her. And she said, I don't feel like these authors were talking to me, because if they were talking to me, then they would be telling me something I did not know. And I don't want to write for that gaze. I don't want to write, because I believe there are so many prospects and opportunities and worlds outside of that gaze, the white gaze, the gaze of the empire, and I believe, I don't know, I really do believe in taking people seriously and treating people as though they're intelligent, and treating people and trusting that people have already acquired a certain knowledge, that people are eager to learn more. I do truly believe in treating people as equals, particularly on the page.
And that is why you are the premier anti-colonial and anti-fascist writer of your generation. And that's exactly what anti-colonial writing and anti-fascist writing is about. And of course, anti-fascism, anti-colonialism is the same. It's the same, network. It's the same link. But it's basically telling truth in a way that you determine the terms, and not, you don't let the master class, you don't let the liberals, you don't let any of them determine those terms. And that's what's so beautiful and powerful about this book. and why when I was reading it, I was basically kind of in tears, recognizing the entire history of anti-colonial struggle, not just in Palestine, but I'm reading Amilcar Cabral, I'm reading Fanon, I'm reading Angela Davis, I'm reading Sylvia Wynter in your text. I'm seeing all that in your text, so it's there. I know our time. Answer is like your time's up. Our time is coming to a close. Maybe one last question is, what's next for you? What are you going to, where are you going next? What are you doing?
I don't know. I think it's been an interesting year, and a year that has it's been way more than a year, but it's a year that has like kind of filled me with fatigue and with despair and with fear. And I think when you're feeling such times, you need to find ways to reconnect with people on the ground and to kind of re-enmesh yourself in the community. So I think I just want to try to kind of organize as much as I can to foster as many new relationships as I can. This thesis. The thesis of this book. I'm kind of not bored of it, but I've been saying this and shouting about it for many, many years before I even started writing it. And I'm I don't know, I'm ready to I need to do things, even if it's just like, I don't know, even if it's just making graphics for something, or like ghostwriting somebody's article, or like editing something. I think I need to do things in community and with community in order to fill myself with more hope and more optimism, and most importantly, more energy to be able to write the next work.
Right.
But yeah, I that's mainly it.
Well, I just want to tell for the audience, this is the book, Perfect Victims, right? And the Politics of Appeal. It's important to read it because you will be challenged, but you will also be uplifted. And whatever resignation you might be feeling right now, this is a book to read, because we're not done, and this is a global struggle, for something that's even bigger than human rights. It's freedom. So with that, I want to thank you, Mohammed, for this time. I hope that we can have another conversation again. I look forward to that. And make sure everyone get this book, buy many copies, and just circulate it, because this book could save your life.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be with you, and I'm so grateful for the conversation, for your thoughtfulness. It's really just I can't believe this happened even, so I'm really grateful for it, and I hope to see you soon.
Definitely. I will see you soon. Okay. Bye, everybody.